All right, everybody, welcome to another edition of the Leadership Bend television show with your amazing and phenomenal host. Yeah, I'm adding that in this week. And phenomenal host, Ricardo D. Rice. So this is panel number 2. And today we're looking at justice and equity. What do these things mean? Why do they matter? Why should they matter to black men and just the black community as a whole? So as you can see, a whole nother panel of guests today. And there's even a woman today, but you know this woman. You see her every Friday on the Leadership Bend Live podcast, but she's going to introduce herself again anyway. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves starting from the left to the right. So,
Sterling Johnson, Partnership for Southern Equity. Thank you all for having us here today.
You get them a little bit more than that. So
okay, a little bit more. I am the manager of the Just Opportunity portfolio. We focus and specialize on economic inclusion, which is a function of economic development, looking at ways to really center the voices of marginalized communities and historically divested communities of color, finding ways to connect them to opportunity. And of course, criminal justice is a part of that. We look at the ways in which communities of color who've been targeted by different policies, of course, and how that influences their economic opportunity on the other side as well. So, really anxious to have this conversation today, and thankful to be here with this panel of esteemed guests as well.
Okay, Simone,
you all are big time. I'm just regular,
Simone Cherie Price. I represent Reform Alliance. I'm a Georgia campaign organizing lead at Reform. Me Camille started Reform Alliance about 3 years ago, and our focus on policy is always on probation and parole. So essentially those forms of correctional control that have to do with being beyond the walls, but that also keep people locked in a system of mass incarceration even following their sentencing. So we work on a lot of lobbying, a lot of organizing, a lot of public policy communications, messaging. I do co-host the Leadership Live on the podcast on Fridays, but it's nice to be invited here. And yeah, very
awesome. Well, Chris Bruce. I am a lawyer, a lobbyist, and a lecturer. So I own the Bruce Law Firm, where we exclusively represent people of color who have been unjustly prosecuted by our criminal legal system. As also a lobbyist, I'm the political director for the American Civil Liberties Union of Georgia. So we're at the forefront of fighting for your civil rights and civil liberties under the Gold Dome and within your neighborhoods. And I lecture. I speak at often colleges and other universities, law schools, about law and what politics and law deal with altogether. Most importantly, I'm a local black man. So I just like sports and do everything else that I need to do.
Yeah, because you're the only one on the panel. Like, you're the only local black man on the panel. I don't. Yeah. What was that?
All important.
But are you from Atlanta, though?
Yeah, exactly. Are you from Atlanta?
Yeah.
What part?
Inside or outside the person? I'm just playing.
Okay, I live in Stone Mountain, so I can't say anything.
I'm Decatur, so so I could.
I'm not from it, so I can't.
No, I'm not from city of Decatur. Yeah.
And it begins. All right, so let's start from brass tacks. So I'm gonna start with you, Simone. What is a lobbyist? For people that don't know what that is, what is a lobbyist? What do they do?
Well, of course, it's a much longer lobbyist, but what I will say about this, a lobbyist, and somebody has to register as a lobbyist, which could be you, it could be anyone. There are citizen lobbyists. If you're going to register as a lobbyist, it's because you make a certain amount of money and spend that amount of time trying to influence people who are elected or appointed as officials to take action on a particular piece of legislation, whether it's against or for. So it's just a matter of keeping track of the individuals who are paid to talk to their legislators, which you can do and anyone can do unpaid. Did you want to elaborate on that at all?
Yeah, you pretty much summed it all together. You have paid lobbyists who have to register with the state of Georgia, and if you're a citizen, you don't. Biggest point of that is if you're going to give gifts to elected officials, you have to show that. You have to register that with the state of Georgia. If you're a citizen, you don't. The biggest thing, and we might just jump into it later on, there are over about 3,000 registered lobbyists in the state of Georgia. Probably less than 60 of them are people of color. So when we talk about when you're dividing up the budget, money that's going to healthcare, why we have some of the highest levels of maternal mortality, education, it's because we don't have black people at those tables to lobby with. So 5% of all lawyers in the United States are black people. Probably less than 1% are lobbyists.
How does that happen? How does stuff like this happen? I guess that's the major question. Like, is a lobby something you go to school for? Is it something you fall into? Like, how does this happen in theory?
Oh, how do you become a lobbyist? That's a good question. Because I literally got a phone call 3 days after Donald Trump was elected president. And it was from the ACLU of Florida. They called me and they said, we need a lobbyist in the state of Georgia because we believe that his policies on the federal level are going to be reflected the most in Georgia. I said, okay. I started naming some people, my friends, Lawrence, Kristen, Dashika, like their lobbyists. She was like, I already talked to them. She was like, they all gave me your name. And I was like, I've never lobbied before. She said, you'll figure it out. I've literally been trying to figure it out ever since. So yeah, it's more about, in my opinion, who do you know, who do you trust? So a lot of times, and I tell this to people all the time, it's not about you just knowing your state representative, your state senator, your elected official. It's about if they know you.
Right.
So if they know you by name and they say, well, this is how Cardo's going to feel about this bill, I need to be wary about how I vote on it. That's when you have power. And that's what really changes within our community.
All right, so this notion of equity, explain equity to me. What exactly is equity, black equity, things of that magnitude? What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, I think a lot of equity and kind of the concept we confuse with equality, right? A lot of people talk about equity as being, sameness or giving everybody the same thing. And really what it is meeting people where they are and responding to their condition, whether that be, making them whole in one particular way or another. And so when we think about economic equity, of course, people talk about things like reparations, right? And we're not specifically going to advocate for that today, but I'm just giving an example of what would be essentially, there was a community that has been disproportionately affected by policy or otherwise that we now need to make whole in some particular way or another. And that's not to, go about it with race neutral policy or other types of means. That just says, well, we can just eliminate racism from the way that we talk or the way that we think or the way we respond. Is really about how do we change functionally these systems and how they relate to people. And really, when we talk about racial justice and racial equity, that's the core of the work that we're trying to do at Partnership for Southern Equity as well.
It's like level the playing field, or just to, because we have the conversation about reparations and it gets very like tug of war-ish, because some people are like, well, descendants of slaves or things of that magnitude. So what kind of rubric would we even be looking at if we were talking about reparations?
Oh, that's a big conversation, a loaded conversation, right?
I know, and it is, but we were sitting in that space, so I want to throw,
I'm trying to think about the best example. Equity is, and I like to break it down kind of when we think about it at a 101 level, right? Equity and equality is the same bike for everybody, right? So I'm taller than Simone, right? And so if Simone's trying to ride my bike, then her bike might be a little bit wobbly, right? She might not be able to really function with the pedals, right? It might be uncomfortable for her to sit in. If I had a bike and I'm comparing it to someone smaller than my bike, right, then I'm on a bike that's too small for me, right? Even though there might be the same bikes, it's about how do you get somebody what they need, wearing the same pair of shoes, right? I wear a size 12. You might wear a size 14, right? If he tries to put on my shoes, like my shoes aren't comfortable for him. So it's about how do you respond to that individual person's need and what it looks like. On the reparation scale, I'm not going to get too deep into this. A lot of times we kind of cannibalize these conversations around equity, and a lot of it is because we're fighting for our slice of the pie. And we really think about it in the economic development and economic inclusion sense. We talk about how equity is the superior growth model. Right, that when everybody has a chance to participate, then that only makes everything go smoother. There are more people that can, buy and sell. There's more people who can participate in commerce, right? And so even when we think about the reparations conversation, there are whole segments of our population right now that are locked out of the economic, development of our communities, of our cities, of our country as a whole, right? And what does that do to a capitalist system is that there are people who can't participate. So, we've got to start thinking around this entire conversation on reparations and fairness and equity a lot of different ways, but, really making it, comfortable and to really enter into those spaces too, I think is a natural and necessary first step.
Okay, you said a mouthful.
I did.
You said a mouthful.
That's what happens when you throw out reparations. It's like the second question,
Which I normally wouldn't have, but since we set into that space, I was like, well, we can kind of dabble into it a little bit. Anybody got any other thoughts?
I was going to go, it kind of leads into what you first asked, which is lobbyists and everything else. Lobbyists are always looking out for their clients. So paid or unpaid, I consider myself a social justice lobbyist. So if I go and say, well, Black women have the highest maternal mortality rate in the state of Georgia than anywhere else in the nation, hence even the world, who's at the table to say, well, white women are getting this type of health care? Who's at the table to say that Black women should be getting that type of health care? When do you get that equity conversation that's going into it of saying who's speaking up to them and the needs that they go through all together? So it's really going with everything that you just said, voicing the concerns of a community or a person all together and getting that solution.
So it kind of seems, because I had to ask this question with the first panel because we had a diversity and inclusion officer, Dr. Shelton Good. So I guess I'm going to have to ask the same question. Do we need some kind of affirmative action bill that says this quota needs to be at these tables? Or is it something that we can actually tackle Because we keep seeing it. It doesn't matter what panel we have. It's the same thing. The right people are not at the table. So how do we get the right people at the table? Do we need a bill that says this is the area that you're in? It requires 3 to 4 minorities. Those minorities look like a black male, a black female. How do we do that? Do we need another affirmative action bill, or something like that? You're the lawyer, so I'm asking you.
I was about to say that's
I'm asking you.
Respect, you mean like our representatives, our elected representatives?
Yeah, just like some kind of rubric that says, or some kind of bill that says these people have to be at these tables and they need to look like this to at least open the door to make them more plausible to actually make it happen, versus now where you're just kind of like, well, it'll be nice to have some black folks or some Latino folks at the tables, but we're not really going to enforce it, versus affirmative action saying, no. There's a quota you need to meet or something like that. Is that kind of
my sensibilities personally, but
I can say a few words. I mean, they're trying that out in certain areas, like in California. They're saying that, well, if you have a company that is this large that makes this amount of money, you have to have a woman on your board of chairs, one of your chairs. In other ways, those are quotas. I'm more for a minority preference within certain types of situations.
Explain.
So there's a quota is just basically going into, well, you have this many people, so you need this many people who come from a diverse group. And that can go with all your civil rights type of issues, such as gender, race, plenty of them. But when it comes down to it, you really need to look at which communities are being impacted the most.
Right.
Something that's happening here right now is we're talking about distributing cannabis licenses for medical marijuana in the state of Georgia. You're going to get about 4 or 6 licenses. The question is, who are those licenses going to go to? Now, it takes a lot of money to do these types of situations, to build these type of plants, processing, distributing cannabis. Does the African American community hold that type of wealth? And if they don't, are they capable of doing these type of things? If they are, what can we do to get them these type of licenses? Not a handout, but literally educating, equipping, and empowering them to work within their own communities.
Yeah.
So I don't know if a quota is necessary, but the resources have always been necessary for us to take our communities to another level.
Let me piggyback on that. I mean, we talk about, I think the difference between quotas is that it focuses on just being there in space. Right. And we know that just being in a space does not equip you with power. This is about power sharing. It's about shifting power dynamics. Right. And what does that look like? It doesn't mean that I'm just there. Right. And how am I being included? How am I being consulted? How are the communities that are being impacted being thought about through this? I mean, you talk about even in the private sense or the private commerce sense, we started seeing things like community benefits, right, being tied to like certain types of developments, or, corporate interests being tied to like supplier diversity programs. Like there are a lot of different ways to attach it. I do think, to your ultimate question, do we need another bill that addresses that? Yes, because a lot of our bills are dealing with the world that we exist from, frameworks that are outdated, right? And we need to start thinking about that a different way. But at the core of that has to be reshifting kind of the power dynamic at the center of the.
Simone? The only thing I'd add is that, because I'm only thinking about the criminal legal system, is that one of the things that's a barrier to getting that far is just a lack of knowledge and an unwillingness to gather that knowledge and that data. Like one of our biggest challenges trying to pass reform bills, even on the reentry side where somebody's not in the system, because at least our State Department of Corrections does have to keep tabs on some identifiers, is when somebody's out of the system, we know that there's sentencing disparities because we can see that. We know that there is a disparate racial population in terms of who's on probation and parole, and the people tend to stay on probation and parole much longer. They tend to be monitored much more closely. We don't really have specific numbers there because there's only so much data that's required to keep tabs on. And one of the hardest things about getting our bills passed in this space has been that there's no data. And even trying to pass a bill to collect data, just a bill to say, hey, can we start saying what the average income is for these people before we say that they aren't paying their probation fees? Or can we try to just say how many jobs that they've applied for, or if they're parents, and if we can figure out how bad we're impacting the community by sending them back to jail? There's a lot of resistance to even collecting that data and getting those numbers. And there's always the excuse that it's going to be arduous, that it's going to take forever, it's going to be very expensive. And so by keeping the numbers unclear and by making it hard to figure out what the problems are, solutions become that much further away. So that is a very, very big battle that we're still fighting right now.
How do you even fix something like that? How would you even go about, like, what do y'all, how would you even go about fixing something like that?
Voting for different people who are willing to spend a little bit of money to figure out what the problems are and who value data. Data is important. Right. Especially if you're going to say that, we we don't need to be partisan about justice. We need to have facts. We need to have figures. We got to spend money to collect facts and figures. We got to do something differently.
I think sometimes you have to make the efficiency case, right, or the business case for doing things differently. I mean, when you talk about evidence-based practice, like informed decision making, like all of that comes from data. Like, how do you do it? I mean, sometimes it's just about finding that right stakeholder in the midst of that process and appealing to them and say, hey, this will make your life easier, right? To be able to say, this is why I made certain decisions. And sometimes, I hate to say that that's the way to do it, because sometimes we get focused a lot on the moral imperatives at the center of these conversations. But sometimes it's just about who are you dealing with and what's going to be the right lever to trigger their action. Right. And I think that goes to
it does everything that y'all are saying. I completely agree with. But I think if we break it down to a simple level, there's some people who do not want this to change.
Absolutely,
right? So if we're going ahead and saying, I own a private prison, why do I want data from them to make better decisions for people not to go to prison? No, I'm getting rich off of this. Bail's industry or anything else. Some people have such a lack of empathy towards the rest of society. It's sickening, but it's the truth. And until we start recognizing that all together, and that's why I think there is such a push of people saying, you can no longer be silent. Silence is complacency and letting this go through. You need to speak out against these evils within our community. Yeah. And not only speak out, don't just put in a statement. Do something about it. And that doing something about it really goes within your core and your culture of who you really are, you as a corporation or a company altogether. And that's what people should be evaluating themselves. Most of us really believe that a society should be judged off of the least of things. So the people who are homeless or anything else, you don't judge how many millionaires or billionaires you have. You judge by how many homeless people you have. And that's where we get into another conversation like equity and everything else, reparations. Because we shouldn't be focusing on getting more people rich. We should be focusing on making everyone better, everyone in the whole, and just a simple level of a standard of living in our society, education and healthcare that we as Americans or just people altogether should always adhere to.
All right, so we're going to take our first break, and when we come back, we're going to have more of this amazing panel on the Leadership in Television show with your host, Ricardo D. Rice. All right, so we are back, and when we left, we were talking about research and the necessity of it not having it. These two on break, we're talking about examples. So Simone, start with your example, and then Chris, you lead in your example.
Right, so we're talking about how difficult it is to gather data to talk about some of these issues, right? So like to try to understand the real nuts and bolts of the problem and to get that scope. And that is very important for legislation, and also to make sure legislation is good legislation, to have metrics to track it by. One of the examples I was referring to was actually a bill that I think broadly was called the shackling bill, essentially, or dignity for incarcerated women, and that was
they were called the shackling bill.
It was called the shackling bill because pregnant women in our carceral system were often shackled while they were giving birth. And quite frankly, anytime they needed treatment during pregnancy. So Pamela Wynn is the founder of Restore Her, awesome woman, by the way. And she was the face of that campaign for years. She did the federal bill, had it passed at the federal level. Georgia's our home state. We passed the bill here as well. One of the provisions of that bill, this was my example, was to start tracking women in the system and figure out how many there are, when they're being checked on, when they're receiving medical care, what kind of medical care they're receiving.
So wait, are you telling me they're not doing that now?
No.
So they're just women in the system pregnant with no broad
numbers about what that looks like. So again, no ability to be accountable for maybe the health of any children who are born outside of the system, no ability to understand how much money is being spent on lives of the unborn, which is very important in Georgia, by all accounts. So, but that's just one of many examples in which collecting data on these issues, which we would love to do, if anything, to figure out, again, to make sure a bill is a good bill.
So how are we filling in this gap? Like, if there's no research to base these things off, what are we doing? Just giving fictitious numbers?
It's subjective.
To an extent, there's also data done in other states. So like we rely a lot of times on a lot of research that's been done elsewhere on studies that occur in New York or that occur in California or in Florida. At least at Reform Alliance. For policy, there's always policy organizations that are nationally that do national work. The Center for State Government is a pretty big policy outfit. Sometimes they can do fiscal impact studies and things like that, but basically have to rely on what data you are given and what data you're given by our agencies.
And that's the real fight within it, right? One, I want to address the slight shade that she had in there, which was great. How she was like, well, pregnancy and life is very important to the state of Georgia. Except they'll pass an abortion ban bill, but once someone's born, they won't give them any type of health care or any type of follow-up with it.
Right.
That's what life really is. Otherwise, you're just pro-pregnancy or you're pro-birth.
Right.
But after the birth, what are you doing? Are you making sure that this kid is well-nourished, has the education, has the wraparound services to make sure they grow into a citizen or adult within our society in itself? But the thing is, again, people don't want to change. There are a lot of people out there who make a lot of money off of the suffering of people, especially people of color, especially Black people. So yes, it's hard to go down to the Capitol and say, we need to change how we do this. It's like, well, why do we need to change it? Oh, show me the numbers to change it. Well, you guys don't track the numbers. So I can't show it to you, but I can give you personal stories of people who've gone through the system. Well, you just brought in 10 people. Well, those 10 people are representing a lot of others. So, but until you actually start mandating us putting together policies to look into the data, we can't make the right informed type of thing, which even if you take it away from being evil or not evil, just you as a taxpayer saying we could be wasting millions of dollars within our carceral system, with inefficiencies or anything else. There's a lot of people who are behind bars that shouldn't be behind bars, which, again, if you're spending $72, $78 a day on somebody who should be behind bars, that money could go to education, it could go to healthcare, it could go to a lot of other things.
Now we talking about prisons. Let's get there. So let's start with, what is mass incarceration? Whoever wants to start.
I was going to say, but I mean, you'd be perfect to speak to. I'll just start with mass incarceration is the over-criminalization of the American populace, period. It is what happens when we have over 80,000 plus laws on the books, plus laws that we can't even count to determine what's criminal and what isn't criminal, and basically criminalizing everything short of perfect behavior, whether it is, the big ugly crimes that people talk about when they say rape and murder, even though they make up less than 8% of the overall incarcerated population. And when we talk about jaywalking, which is a misdemeanor, or changing lanes without using your signal, which is a misdemeanor.
Or handing out water to voters in line.
So we really gonna do that? We're just gonna throw that in there.
That's part of what creates it. But go ahead.
And to put it in context, we know that the United States incarcerates more people than any other country in the entire world. So you'll see people up here saying, "Oh, China's bad. They have less people in prison than we do. Russia is horrible. Less people. North Korea, all these other countries, and yet we're number one with incarcerated, especially with the inequities when it comes to people of color. We definitely have more people of color who are behind bars than we do not. And it's not that people of color create more crime. It's just that we literally have a system that is designed to keep people of color down.
Okay. Expound on that, because people say that a lot, but I don't think a lot of people know what does that mean? If I'm an average person, what does that mean to me? Or what does that look like? What does that picture look? I know it's a very big, but
I'm glad that you said what it looks like. And let's start from I'm going to go back. I love history. So once we actually did get the right to vote, Black people, Black men, Black women still didn't have the right to vote. Black people came out in droves and actually did vote. So after the Civil War, you had over 22 congressmen, Black men, who were sent to Congress. And you had elected officials all across the nation, over 2,000 who were actually elected into office. They shut that down immediately. So that happened in 1866. By 1870, you had Black codes that were put in saying, well, if you're ever a slave before, you can't vote. You had a grandfather who was able to vote, you can't vote, or anything else. So that type of power was pushed back. Those same Black people that were voted in office were voted out immediately. That's what we talk about institutions. We're talking about laws that are specifically targeted. One of the biggest ones that impacts our community is moral turpitude. If you ever commit a crime of moral turpitude, which is just considered like some sort of sin, because we never really defined it. In the state of Georgia, it's considered any felony. Other states have defined it about certain types of felonies. Any felony, you're stripped of your right to vote until you actually get off of parole and probation, pay certain fines and fees. The reason why that makes an impact is because, again, if we're mostly targeted towards that, you have a lot of other Black people who do have felonies disproportionately. That means those people cannot vote. And if you cannot vote, you cannot elect somebody who's going to represent your interests that deals with all the other issues that we had talked about before.
And
so hopefully that's a direct example.
I'll just jump in really quickly to add on to that. I mean, even in the tangible example, you talk about the right to vote, right? And how you criminalize certain behaviors. I mean, we've seen, of course, across history, the way in which Black and brown communities are over policed, right? And so it's not a function of, there's this kind of correlation that we like to think about. It's kind of this moral argument that there are communities who are decrepit, right? That they are, bankrupt morally. They're incapable of behaving in a way that's acceptable. And so we have to give a special type of attention to those communities. We know that that's fundamentally untrue, but if that's the way our policing system looks at communities of color or Black and brown communities in particular, right, then they're patrolling for certain types of things. They're looking for certain types of behaviors. And when they see things that might fit into what their criteria, what that behavior is, then they see an opportunity to criminalize. And then, of course, then you're into the system. You might have a felony. Now you're stripped of your right to vote and can't, engage with the civic process the way that it's designed for in the first place.
Let me give a brief example of something that happened recently: the murder of Rayshard Brooks by the police. Right, and I point this out of saying there's a difference between law enforcement and public safety. So, in a law enforcement model, Mr. Brooks was at a Wendy's. He got the police called on him. They didn't know he was drunk or asleep at the wheel. Police officers come out. They give him a DUI test or something else that says, "Are you intoxicated or not?" They ask him to say, "Hey, well, it looks like you failed our test. We're going to need to arrest you. Get out the car." He says, "No, don't arrest me. Let me call up my aunt. Let me call up somebody else to pick me up. I just want to go home." Scuffle ensues. He runs away, gets shot in the back, dies. Those two police officers are now up on charges right now. That's a law enforcement model. Mm-hmm. Public safety, still, you can call out the police. Police come out and say, "Well, Mr. Brooks, we don't know if you're intoxicated or just tired. One, thank you for pulling over because you're no longer a threat to yourself or the general public at large because you could have crashed if you were tired. We don't know yet. Two, why don't we get you home? So can you call somebody? Can we call you a Lyft or Uber? Can we take you home to your wife and your children where you are the sole breadwinner and make sure that you get home?" Right. And then those two police officers are out to help someone else. Again, public safety versus law enforcement altogether. And that's what we really need to start thinking about within our communities and how we want the police to really react towards us.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So is public safety a concept or it should be a division of law enforcement?
No, but I was going to say, I'm sorry, but that's like the broader question that I think you're getting at that's so important and so critical. And the reason why, even at a small level, all the animosity you feel when you get pulled over by a cop, especially if you knew that you blew a stop sign, it really doesn't have anything to do with that. It really doesn't. Like, despite how ugly that interaction can become and how fatal that interaction can become, the law enforcement piece is the part, right? It's like the more interactions you have with armed officers who do spend a lot of time working all different types of crimes, across their career, the greater the chances are that you will have a hostile interaction with the law enforcement officer. The greater the chances are that you will be cited, even if it's just for a misdemeanor. And so the public safety idea is that for the peace, dignity, and good order, I think, in the state of Georgia, that things happen, right? Which means that you can't loiter at a Wendy's. You can't be asleep at the wheel, behind your vehicle. Those are public safety reasons, right? Why that individual might be approached. But the fact that I have to enforce the law, all those laws, no matter how arbitrary they may be, and I'm doing it with an armed officer, I think that's where that's the key and fundamental difference.
You were kind of talking about racial bias as it pertains to police and stopping individuals. Is that a training issue, or is that something that we need to create a whole other concept or a whole other thought process around?
It's a little bit of both, right? I mean, bias manifests a lot of different ways. There's individual bias, cultural bias, systemic bias, right? Institutions, right? What does all of this mean, right? If you are an individual officer who has, certain types of beliefs around communities of color, right? Then when I'm policing, then I'm looking at them through a certain lens that I have biased myself. If I have a policing situation where I know that my behavior towards certain communities is going to be shielded and protected, right? I know that this institution is going to insulate me around my bad acting, right? Then that's an institutional bias issue, implicit bias, right? How do judges look at sentencing? How do they understand what types of questions are we asking? All of these things are addressed, but to your original question, I think a lot of that has to be dealt with a certain paradigm. That goes to that data question, right? How are we identifying where our bias manifests? If we can see it, right, with data and numbers, we can track it. If we can understand it at that point, then we can be more proactive in addressing it. But I think that we fundamentally stripped ourselves of the ability to fundamentally address it because we're not doing it with a level of accountability and a level of intentionality as well.
If we could add into it a historical context again, police didn't just pop up in this country.
Right.
Their origins literally come from slave patrols that were made in the Carolinas, saying we're going to track down, harass, terrorize, and kill a Black community to keep them down. Those were the first state-funded types of situations of law enforcement. And it's just morphed into the police altogether. So when people are saying, well, we need to change the structure altogether, it's because the origins of it were based off of harassing and killing Black people. So when people are saying defund the police, that's not necessarily well, we need to get rid of all police officers. It means that if you do have a call about a mental health situation, why can't we call out a mental health supervisor instead of a police officer who has to respond to every other type of situation? Who's not trained to deal in mental health? Let's get somebody who is trained in mental health. Again, it saves money and it saves lives.
Defund the police. Define it for me, because you went there brief. So,
I was going to say, I definitely shouldn't be the best person to answer that question.
Okay, well, somebody define defund the police, because I think this is another term that people use.
I do know that it's a total misnomer. So it's not about defunding the police. It's about the reallocation of police services or police operations for the entire public safety department. So there's always different layers in terms of what we give to our law enforcement agencies. That's the case, period. So the question is not about getting rid of police and creating some sort of a citizen policing model. The question is just, do we add funding for individuals who are better able to deal with certain situations when we know that those are a lot of calls that we get? And police departments do, I think, for the most part, even in Georgia, track what kind of calls they respond to and how officers spend their time. So I think it would be, at least an implementation case, pretty easy to understand, well, what would it look like if we have less of our officers dealing with these sorts of calls or these sorts of situations?
I'll add on top of that, a lot of the calls to defund are related to repurposing the funding that they are given, that we know that our law enforcement models right now are militaristic in style, right? That they respond to certain communities in certain types of ways, that they're overarmed, that they're over-prepared, right? You're going into these communities preparing yourself for war, when in reality, you just need a mental health professional, right? And that's not to say that there aren't sectors of our law enforcement that should be prepared to respond to those types of threats. But when the overwhelming use of the dollars that you're being budgeted go towards, weapons, right, and those types of protections for institutions themselves, then you're robbing yourself of the opportunity to give funding to something that will be necessary to really increasing the wellness and the overall emotional wellness of the communities that you serve. So that's really at the center of this opportunity to defund the police. Is really about repurposing that money for other opportunities.
What you said about a response really goes towards what happened on January 6th when we did have an insurrection incident at our nation's capital. I know.
I have nightmares about that. That's
my birthday.
Yeah.
So I'm texting congressmen, you safe and everything. I'm like, yeah, we're cool. But when it comes down to it, you had a lot of Black Lives Matter protests who were marching the streets, exercising their First Amendment rights under the Constitution and Bill of Rights and everything else. Compared to literally, they tried to overthrow this government altogether. When Black Lives Matter protests were happening in D.C., you had nothing but National Guard, armed militias, federal agents there lined up. When this happened, and literally they planned it for months.
Yeah. Right.
Everybody knew what was happening. You had nothing. You had officers helping out insurrectionists going into the Capitol. And that goes within the fundamentals of our society. So when people are saying, oh, I was surprised it was happening, I can't say what, or the reactions that happened within it. I think our Vice President, Kamala Harris, summed it up perfectly. They were like, well, how did you feel with it? I felt the same way when a white boy went into the South Carolina church and shot up all the Black people, or all the other incidents with Black people have done. So he was like, I wasn't surprised, but I'm now seeing that America's waking up towards this. The question is, what do we do now? Because there were reports that were done by even Trump's Homeland Security Agency of saying the biggest threat to America is domestic terrorism, right? White supremacist organizations and militias that come together that are plotting against the government. All
right, hold that thought, because this is going to go somewhere. All right, so we're going to take a second break, and when we come back, we're going to finish that thought and look at some other stuff on the Leadership and Television Show with your host, Ricardo D. Rice. All right, so finish that thought where you were. Do you remember where you were left off at?
I think we were talking about the insurrection.
Yeah. How does that happen, and why does it look so different from Black Lives Matter protests? The way it was armed and stuff like that.
Well, it's the institutional response within it. And they're still having hearings about it, saying, why did y'all have literally National Guard and federal agents out there against Black Lives Matter protesters when it was completely peaceful? But you had an armed insurrection. People had bombs. People were armed. They marched the Confederate battle flag through our Capitol. That didn't even happen during the Civil War. And not only that, as you had said before, they were planning this out for quite some time. So people were saying, well, maybe it was just a bias. People thought Black people would cause problems compared to when they saw white people up there, it was going to be just fine. And that's why you didn't have exactly the preparedness for it. That is the most basic, simple type of situation that we run into literally on a day-to-day basis. Are you more scared of a Black man walking down the street or a white man walking down the street?
Parole reform.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about
Probation and parole. So this is a situation that's different state by state. And I think, and I'm sure you can attest to this much more because of what you do and representing people, but it is very difficult for someone who has already been through the system and by this point has been found guilty of something or pled guilty to something to justify wanting relief from a situation that is not jail or prison. Probation is a privilege, is a quote that our former Attorney General used to say all the time. That is still very commonly heard among folks who either work for the Department of Community Supervision or Department of Corrections, is that if you are either on probation or on parole, you should be grateful. It means that you're not currently still behind bars. And for some people, and some very limited situations, including individuals who are parents, especially people who are formerly the sole caregivers, it is sometimes a great relief to be on probation. But Georgia has longer probation sentences than any other state times 4. We have more people under probation or parole than any other state by about the same multiplier. So we keep people under correctional control outside of our jails for a very long time, long enough for them to make a small mistake. And when I say a small mistake, I mean a non-criminal mistake. I mean forgetting to report 1 month, or I mean changing your address and not saying anything, or going to see family or friends in the next state and not saying anything after 6, 7, or 8 years. And during that time, while you're still serving your sentence, you're barred from participation in so many of the civic activities you talked about before. And again, it's jail outside of jail.
And we talked about on the show, because I was flabbergasted, because apparently I've been on parole, about tickets, that traffic tickets.
On probation.
I meant probation, not parole. Not parole. I meant not. Let's clarify
Georgia
that.
Uses misdemeanor probation quite a bit, and it's partly why I think it is why our probation population is so large. Is that if you can't afford to pay your ticket, and we have something called pay-only probation, and you're on that payment plan, you are technically serving a probation sentence, and most municipalities will have a little probation office in there for you. But no, you weren't you were misdemeanor, but you were not on.
It's just the concept. It's like I'm in here for a ticket, and then by the time you add all these taxes and stuff on it, the ticket, we're way past the ticket, and it's way past 1 or 2 months.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's like, how does that work? But okay, yeah. I guess.
I want to add 2 things to that. One, Georgia, emphasizing what you just said, has the highest rates of governmental correction and supervision. Number 1 in the nation. It's crazy. And 2, dealing with your situation, Georgia's only one of 8 states that actually criminalizes tickets. The rest of the nation doesn't even see it as a criminal act. It's a civil act. So you can get a fine and go away, but you don't have a criminal record.
Yeah, some sort of ordinance violation or something.
Right.
Like that, yeah.
Something completely simple.
I guess my question becomes, so, because Georgia's always the exception and usually never in a good way. So is that because of laws that are passed? Is it legislation, or what is it?
I think what usually happens too is that people aren't always aware of the impact of that. When you can't afford your ticket, I mean, people very quickly, you have a payment plan, I need that payment plan. I don't want to spend that money right now.
Right.
Even, if I have $200, even if I do have it, if somebody tells you can pay it off over a year, people will very quickly say yes to that, not understanding that they're going to end up on probation. And I think the same thing goes for a lot of situations where most people are individuals navigating the justice system. I don't think in fact, I'm pretty sure a lot of people don't look for counsel for things like a traffic ticket. However, there's also situations in which you don't know what you're being barred from until it comes up again. When you say that you can't vote or that you can't participate on the jury, which is critically important, when there are certain industries that you may be barred from, if they don't fall within your scope, I think people don't necessarily know what they're missing out on. A lot of people ignore the jury notices, and so being ineligible to participate during that time does not strike as critical to them. There are highly regulated industries like the financial industry, for example, or the investment industry, in which if you've got a misdemeanor.
Before you move there, because we discovered that on Friday. So the significance of voting and the correlation to, why does that matter? For those that, because we went on Friday, but if you don't watch the podcast and you're watching a TV show, why does that matter?
Because the Rashad Brooks case, for example, the next time you see one of these things happening, the Ahmaud Arbery case, which is in Cobb County, Keith Haring, who was shot down by somebody conducting a citizen's arrest in Clayton County. When you get a jury notice in a county where something like that is happening, you need to be on that jury and you need to be a part of that process if you have the opportunity. And signing that away it's part of the reason why we feel like, where's the jury of my peers? A lot of times. But then when I talk to my family and my friends and they say, oh no, I got out of that. I'm so glad I got out of that summons. And it's like, you may have just robbed the next black person of the justice that they needed because you may have been the only black face that was in that jury.
Right. Okay, you can finish the rest of your thought. I mean,
No, I was thinking about
the rest of your thought.
I was thinking about the economic piece because I did work in finance for a very brief amount of time, and there are very stringent background checks, and there are plenty of industries like that, but in which if you do have a misdemeanor, which is what it would look like when they ran a check for a ticket like that, that's it. There are certain industries that are very, very strict. And even when they're not that strict, it exacerbates the background check process. So again, it's just about being in the system to some extent. And that's damaging regardless of how severe what you've done was.
Chris, you said something that kind of set in my head when we were talking about the vagueness of some of these laws. You were talking about a specific law and you were saying it's kind of vague. Is that a real issue? Because we talked about the citizen arrest one, and when you look at it, it's like the writing of it, it's just like, well, that's very vague. So people can kind of slip in and out of it to kind of use it as a defense. How big of an issue is the vagueness of the law in Georgia? A lot of this legislation. Is it a big issue or a small issue? What is it?
It's a huge issue. And one, your Georgia legislator gets paid about $14,000 a year, right? It's a part-time legislature. They really don't have any type of staff or anything else. And who does that benefit? That benefits lobbyists. And who typically gets benefited from that? People who have money to pay for lobbyists to influence them. So if I'm a legislator and I'm trying to draft a new law or policy, I don't have staff for it. There's no elected official college. I'm going to have to rely on somebody to give me the data. I'm going to rely on someone like this. However, that person is going to skew everything of saying, well, we're going to draft these policies to benefit my client who's already making millions of dollars and to box out other clients who can't afford somebody to be down at the Capitol. That's why. And dealing with the criminal justice context, it's more of you determine laws to be ambiguous and vague for the police to have their discretion. But their discretion is not applied evenly altogether. If I know that they have a bias, like you were talking about before, against black people, and I give them the power to do it, like with over the thousands of laws that we already have on the books that are criminalized, which, and this is where people get mad at me, was done by Democrats and Republicans all together, then the police are going to use that as a power and abuse it within our communities. So yes, when it comes down to laws, when it comes down to situations, we have to be very precise on the problems that we're trying to solve. Whenever there's a new crime on the books, I don't say no. Just no. We have enough criminal laws on the books right now. We need to be taking them off of the books instead of that. And I think cannabis is one of the prime examples for it.
I was going to say, and yet with every new emotional thing that happens, there's always a law. Like I have a law for that. I have an idea for that. And the Porch Piracy bill that I think Representative Bonnie Rich was speaking for this past session that just came through. It's the same sort of idea. And the idea was that because there's been so many Amazon packages, things like that going on since COVID, and so many people are staying home and even more people are ordering everything they need, we should make it an automatic felony to have someone steal a package from off of a porch.
Oh, good grief.
Now, this was a bill that was proposed. And again, it's the emotional argument that's always being used in terms of like, well, what if this is an elderly person and that's their life-saving medication and just got swiped off the porch? I don't know what most Amazon packages look like in aggregate. I don't know if that data is publicly available or if Jeff Bezos has made it publicly available.
I'm sure you'll call him because you know you love Jeff.
I would find his phone number. I love
and she loves him. She loves Zuckerberg.
Pretty sure we could be talking about $5 headbands for goodness sake. We could be talking about toothbrushes or toothpaste, things that if anyone else was caught stealing from a store, we'd be looking at a misdemeanor at most because of just the dollar amount. But because it's a porch, Like, we've created a whole new law for that. Never mind we have theft, never mind we have burglary, never mind we have trespassing. We have plenty of laws about taking things. I think 3 or 4 different types of theft. But we had to create a whole new law for this, and it's a very harsh law. I think it's just a perfect example.
Okay, we're going to take another break, our last break. And when we come back, we're going to get the top issues in all 3 of your fields and the solutions to those issues. So stick around the Leadership and Television Show with your host, Ricardo D. Rice. Okay, so once again, these 3 are guilty of giving all the nuggets away in the break. So I had to stop this one before he said what he was saying. All right, so that thought, the difference between what advocacy and...
Yeah, well, we were just talking a little bit about what can people do right now. Like, if you're just a community member who's interested and wants to be involved, what can you do? And we were talking a little bit about whether you can be in position to advocate, right, or influence policy, or what that looks like. And I was making sure to define advocacy is different than policy, right? That sometimes we focus on advocacy and we think that we're actually influencing policy on the other side of that, but that's an intentional second step in action. Advocacy is really more about building awareness, education, right? Platforms like this that really allow people to engage with the knowledge and say, well, how do I relate to that, right? How can I think about how I can engage with it? But policy is about really crafting a response. And I think this is a perfect intro to even what we've discussed as kind of this session, right? How should we be looking at changing the circumstances, and how can we use legislation or other types of laws, right, to really start moving and repositioning our relationship to the system as a whole? So that's a big conversation, but I think it's important to define and segment those 2 separately.
All right. So what is in your industry? What is a big issue and what is a solution for the average Joe that may be watching?
That's a huge question. It's a million ways.
Look here, you better narrow it down. You have these conversations every day.
I'm going to do from my economic development position. I think it's really more about how do we elevate the needs of communities as it relates to large corporations, mega development. I mean, we see in the cities across the country that the cost of living is going up. That wages have been stagnant, right? That there, of course, is a disproportionate impact coming out of COVID and other types of responses on the most vulnerable communities, while there are still industries that the profits are still going up, right? And so when we talk about wealth and resources, right, and access and how that really drives and relates to all of these different systems, particularly politically, we've got to get more families and more individuals economically solvent, right? Able to not only be able to meet their own needs, but how can I then contribute in other ways to the community around me, whether that be by giving more to a local elected or identifying somebody who might be interested in running for policy, right? And how can we give to them and create a platform for them to be able to stand on and to be competitive? A lot of that starts and ends with economic inclusion and having that opportunity for communities to engage economically through our development.
So because you said a lot. How does the average Joe, how do you do that? Is it a fight that we need to get in to raise the minimum wage? Is that a good place to stand on, or is there something else they should be looking into? I
mean, raising the minimum wage, we talked a little bit earlier about supplier diversity, right? That we don't really recognize that governments buy goods and services from private business owners. Right. And so there are people who own businesses, entrepreneurs. You could be involved in selling a service to your local government, but if the local government isn't constructed in a way to buy from local businesses or small and diverse businesses, they won't do it. They're going to take the easiest way out. Right. And so looking at those types of opportunities, looking at our corporates, right, that when we see, new sky rises being built in Atlanta or any other city, how are they connecting with the communities? Does their workforce reflect the community that they serve? I mean, Georgia brands itself as the #1 state to do business. And we know a lot of that is on the back of giving away huge property tax incentives that, in our regressive tax structure as a whole is a problem. But when your property taxes go towards financing your schools or other types of community services, right, then we're robbing ourselves of a resource that's designed to give back to our communities in order to accommodate these large corporate actors who are bringing in the largest amount of revenue, right? And we're foregoing that. What's the opportunity cost? And nobody really asks those questions. So getting aware of those things, engaging with your electeds, advocating around or raising awareness around things like, raising the minimum wage, workforce inclusion, all of these types of tools, and then education as well, because we know that bridges into workforce as well. So there's a lot of different ways that we can enter into that conversation as a whole.
Yeah, I would say that for me, and I'm thinking about people who are on probation in particular, and at least in the state of Georgia, there is no isolating our conversation about our criminal legal system away from money or economic power, period. So that's an important piece here too. But one of the things I was thinking about in terms of why it's so hard for some folks who, even if they have been given this opportunity, they may have a short sentence, they may be able to get their freedom back, is that they lack social currency as much as they lack economic power or buying power. Like the average person on probation, I think, makes between $18,000 and $22,000 a year. And the reason why needing a social safety net of some sort is so significant for people is because even if you are eligible to, say, get off probation or get your probation modified, what you're coming into is not only the discretion of the court, but what that discretion is based on, right? Are you a person who seems sound, who seems like they can remain employed? Or are you a person who seems totally rehabilitated in their minds? You seem like you're no longer a risk to public safety, or that you're a public. How do you go from looking like a community asset from being a community liability? And a lot of that has to do with the fact that people are very isolated. The cases that I've seen come before judges that seem to go the best are cases in which an employer has vouched for someone, which at least a number of community members have vouched for someone. If that individual has a close-knit family, whether or not that person has a stable job history or a lengthy criminal history, all of that. But most people who find themselves in this system are navigating it very independently, and that is to their detriment. Having a network of people who can vouch for you in a court and will vouch for you in a court and will be a part of your own reentry is really, really important. So I think in terms of what people can do, if you know that someone, and I know you know that someone has a record, but that they're navigating probation or parole, because it's one out of every 19 of us here, then that person could probably really, really use you. And so if you're in that situation, speaking up about it is important, and making your situation known is important to people that you can trust, but also so is vouching for those people if you're not in that situation.
You know exactly what I said. Okay, Chris, you have one of the bigger stakes with what you do. So what?
Let's make it simple but impactful, and that really goes down to voting. 100% voting. So if we put this in context, President Biden won Georgia by 11,000 votes. Senator Warnock won by a little over 90,000 votes. Then you have this bad bill that happens in the state of Georgia about voting. You realize, how does this happen? Well, Democrats needed to pick up 16 seats in our state legislature, our local House of Representatives. If they had picked up 16 seats, they would have had the votes to block this bad bill. So a lot of times people are always thinking federally with the president and the Senate, and they're like, oh, I want my STEMI and stuff. You can get more money locally with cuts in taxes and everything else if you literally voted down ballot for your local House of Representative member or your state senator. So I need people to educate themselves about the voting process. If you're listening to this or you're watching this, you probably already know something, but there are people around you that don't. And you need to start having those type of conversations as well. So I'm trying to put myself out of the job. Literally, I left corporate law to do this type of work because I saw that my people needed me. And I really try to help out as many people as possible doing this. So in my law firm, it was helping people one by one, Black people, not go to jail. I was like, this isn't working. Let me become a lobbyist so I can change the law altogether to represent the 10.5 million Georgians to make sure they don't go to jail altogether. There's an issue that people care about within their own lives. I want you to start educating yourself about that issue. Start talking to your elected official about that issue. If they agree with you on that issue, then that's great. Vote for them. If they don't, find somebody who does and start putting them up so that we can solve these issues down on our local government, from your city council to your mayor to your state house or your state senate.
Can I add on to that really quickly? I think that some of the work we have to do in community too are creating platforms for new leaders, right? Because I think a lot of what you're talking about is that there are ideas or there are passions that our community have that aren't being represented through the political process, right? And that doesn't mean, well, I'm not going to vote, right? That could mean we're going to go find somebody who we're going to amplify, right? Somebody with talent, somebody who has a political acumen, somebody who's interested in doing this type of work. And let's create a platform for them, right? That can look a lot of different ways in a lot of different circumstances, but we don't need to restrict ourselves to always saying, well, the only way it can be done is the way that it has traditionally always been done at the same time.
So that was my next question to Chris. It's like, I know when I vote and I look down the ballot, I see incumbent. And I don't always see somebody that's running against that individual. So is that an issue as well, that not enough people of color or different backgrounds running for these positions. Is that an issue as well?
Absolutely. And the system is set up like that. People always say, well, I'm an elected official. I represent everybody. I can tell you the number one thing that elected officials try to do is get reelected, right? And then after that, they'll be like, okay, well, I'll look into it. So yes, that's where it goes into an incumbent. Well, has that incumbent ever talked to me or have I ever talked to them? And then you figure out, are they the right person for the job? And there are other people in that space who want to, like you were saying, who want to do a better job, who want to have new ideas come to the forefront, especially with millennials being the new biggest population out there. With a lot of other ideas and research and data, now we can actually make a difference within it. But we have to start literally at the bottom, literally one by one within our community where you care the most. And that's what I'm saying. You should be passionate about something. There is some issue that you're very passionate about. And you can find other nonprofit organizations like ACLU, like NAACP, like other organizations that we all work for, and you can team up with them. So it's not something where you have to quit your full-time job or you have to just be out there marching all the time, which marches are helpful and they're educational. But honestly, marches are good for exercise. Okay, I said it. They are. Because what happens down in the Capitol, you can have thousands of people marching. They don't care. I'm going to sign this bill right here and there to make a difference. So there's a difference between marches, and I'm never going to knock it. Do it. But there's other things that you need to do as well.
Yeah, I was going to just say really quickly to that point is that even if everybody can't be a full-time advocate, right? And that's not, even though that can be helpful, especially really if you have a lawmaker who already understands that the system is unfair, which all lawmakers do not believe. But if you're an individual, you have a lot of power and I cannot tell you how much more powerful it could be in some of the conversations we have with lawmakers to have somebody who has gone through that situation right there, who is in their district. Like, hey, this is where you're from. This is this person. They're from there too. This is what they've gone through. Finding those people is really, really critical. And there are ways to do that from a distance. And I think during COVID, if we weren't doing it before, we've all kind of tried to find ways to be digital and to activate people digitally. But if you could spare an afternoon or a day and you know that you want to say something to your lawmaker, I'm pretty sure every advocacy organization would like to plug you in to do exactly that. And that does mean spending just that time to go ahead and meet with the lawmaker. Because if they know who you are and they know your name, that's the beginning of that door. And you can keep knocking on that door every single session that they continue to be elected. And saying that they're just a citizen, they're not an activist, is really powerful for a lot of these people, especially a lot of the Republicans, I think.
Because down there, I have to wear a badge.
Saying we're lobbyists.
Yeah, lobbyists, right? So they already know who I am. They already know what I stand for and everything else. When you come down there and say, I'm your constituent, I can vote you out of office. That's when they really pick up. Because they know if you came down to the Capitol during your work hours, forgot your kids and everything else, to tell me something, you probably talk to your neighbors, the people in your school board, everyone else in that community. And whatever that conversation is,
back to tell them all.
Whatever what you just said, take it right back.
I would just add on to that. And the biggest thing I try to tell people through the last election season is that we had a narrative created that there's no power in the civic process. And I tell people, you got to reclaim the power that you got, right? That there's power that's there to be had. There's influence that's there to be had. But you got to know how to engage with it. One, you have to have the desire to engage with it too, and the knowledge around how to pull those certain levers to get the results you want. And I think that's the biggest thing. If I had to say anything to take away from people today, that you got a voice, you have influence, and you'll have an impact. And I think that the more people we know that are understanding of that get plugged in, then we'll definitely see more changes in the future.
All right. Any other final thoughts before we close? Chris?
No, I mean, that's it. Like I said before, I'm trying to put myself out of the job. So, and I do that by, if you start electing the right people, you don't need me down there trying to shape the laws because you have the right people shaping the laws. I tell people all the time, ACLU just filed a lawsuit on the latest voter suppression law. I'm trying to put my legal director out of the job because if I have the right people to stop them from passing voter suppression jobs, we don't need a legal director anymore. Like this could really all end with us if we all get active and actually do something about it.
Mine would be very, very similar. It's to educate yourself on your issue to the extent that you can, especially when you hear things like defund the police and you don't know how that sounds. And a politician releases a commercial in which a woman is near death and no officer comes and it makes you panic. Always do your best to kind of anything that sounds really extreme, anything that sounds really, really good or too good to be true, always kind of dig underneath that. There's always more to it than what can fit in a headline and in a tweet. And so again, doing that research and education is important. And also, especially in the state of Georgia, I don't know about elsewhere, if you can get a face-to-face, demand a face-to-face with the person whose tax dollars are going to represent you, get a face-to-face with that person. Make it that important. I know we don't do that anymore, but here it makes a difference. So.
And I'll put out a challenge real fast. We'll help you get a face-to-face.
Oh, yeah.
I don't have anything else. I would just say, reach out to us. I mean, like I say, if there's community members, I mean, you all in your organization and how you are engaged. If there's anyone who's interested in getting involved, I know all three of us. I know these two are definitely out beating the paths and doing the work, and we're just as right there with them. And so, to the degree we can, we're definitely going to look to connect them.
All right, so there you have it, our panel on equity and justice. I'm your host, Ricardo D. Rice, and we will see you next Monday, same time, same place, on the Leadership and Television Show with your host, Ricardo D. Rice.